It is a bleak reflection at any time of year, but perhaps especially at this time of year. The electorates of the wealthy developed world are not in a generous mood. Here in the United Kingdom, polling suggests that roughly 2/3 of voters believe that spending on foreign aid is excessive, though it is not clear if it is widely understood how little is actually spent. In the United States, polls consistently suggest Americans believe that foreign aid consumes 25% of the federal budget. It is, as it is in the UK, comfortably less than 1%. Ebenezer Scrooge himself might suggest that these particular purse strings could be loosened somewhat. The problem, perhaps, is that foreign aid is misapprehended as charity, akin to dropping coins into an insistently rattled bucket. It isn't, or at least it shouldn't be. Foreign aid is better understood ideally as an investment, which ultimately benefits donor as well as recipient. A country sends money, expertise and/or technology and receives influence, opportunities and the enhanced security that comes from living in a generally more prosperous and orderly world. Nevertheless, hacking at foreign aid remains a depressingly easy win for cynical governments. The UK's previous Conservative government cut foreign aid spending from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5% in 2021, blaming COVID-19. The UK's current Labour government has said it will restore foreign aid to 0.7%, but hasn't done it yet. Why should wealthier nations be more generous? Why won't politicians stand up for foreign aid? And how might sceptical voters be persuaded that foreign aid can be a win-win proposition? This is the Foreign Desk.
We have a moral obligation, but also it's in our own interest to deal with problems overseas. That's what it all boils down to. And if you start to use the aid programme to try to achieve other objectives, you end up with one scandal after another.
The loss of DFID has had a significant effect on the international humanitarian community being able to carry out effective work in Gaza. And we have seen that very clearly in the events that have taken place since the tragedy of October the 7th last year.
We've seen how COVID knows no borders. We've seen that climate crisis is a crisis of which we're all existentially threatened. So I do think there's a possibility of concocting a new kind of narrative around what purpose aid that we need a champion for.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Joining me first of all is Sir Mark Lowcock, author of The Rise and Fall of the Department for International Development, otherwise known as DFID, of which Sir Mark was the permanent secretary between 2011 and 2017. Mark, there is one chapter in your book which I think sums up what this show is trying to get into, and it is the chapter entitled Lives Getting Better, How DFID Made a Difference. So by way of setting us off, what are some concrete examples that you think of now?
Let me give you a couple, Andrew. Over the course of its life, the Department for International Development paid for the immunisation of 250 million babies and infants. And that was all analysed and looked at. And what was the effect of that? And the result was saving 4 million lives. And the great thing about immunisation is you immunise a baby against childhood diseases, cost you very little money, and they're protected for life. So that's one example. I'll give you another type of example. When I was the head of the DFID office for East Africa, living in Nairobi, a group of my colleagues cooked up a plan with Vodafone and their local subsidiary, which is called Safaricom, to give Vodafone a grant to try to develop the technology that would make it feasible to send a text with purchasing power from one phone to another phone. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, they negotiated with the government of Kenya to make it lawful under the banking regulations there to send money like that. That was the first time ever in the world that that had happened. You and I pay most of our bills doing that kind of thing now. Happened first in Kenya with this grant from the Department for International Development. That whole program, the legislation, the technology, cost $1 million. Probably it was the best ever investment the department made. And there were multiple examples ranging from helping countries plan their future economic management, getting more kids into school. So that very macro level to the very micro level, looking, for example, at how do we make anti-malaria bed nets more effective by developing better insecticide, which work for longer. Multiple examples that the department paid for and got executed on a global scale.
A response to that, which I'm sure you've heard once or twice during your career, might well come from a generic taxpayer of a fortunate, wealthy, developed country, and it might be along the lines of, well, that all sounds marvellous and I'm sure it is, but why should I pay for it?
Well, there's multiple answers that the politicians who have to provide that answer to their taxpayers tend to give. I mean, some of them are about the moral case that no man is an island, as John Donne told us. What happens in one place affects us everywhere. We learned that during the pandemic. So we have a moral obligation, but also it's in our own interest to deal with problems overseas. That's what it all boils down to. There is a question about how much of this stuff, this foreign assistance work, a government or a country wants to do at any moment. And I think one of the things that comes out from the book, certainly one of the messages we try to relay in the book, is there was this golden period really between the late 1990s, the Cold War had ended, there was a peace dividend, lots of conflict had been reduced around the world, the conditions for development and growth and better lives were created. And the moment was seized, in particular by the Tony Blair government, in particular by a minister called Claire Shaw, who decided that she wanted to make a contribution to reducing extreme global poverty. That's the poverty where people are hungry every day. They watch their kids die in infancy. They can't send their children to school. They drink dirty water. In the late 1990s, 40% of the global population were living lives just like that. And Claire Shaw, looking at lots of analysis that had been done, agreements reached in UN conferences, decided it would be possible to reduce those problems by half over the following 15 years. And she made that her life's ambition and the work she wanted to do for the 6 years she was the Secretary of State for International Development. And she enlisted lots of other countries, the US, Europe, in seizing this magic moment and making huge progress. In the life of the Department for International Development between 1997 and 2020, there was a bigger improvement in the life experiences for very poor people than in the whole of previous human history, which runs to 150,000 years now. So beginning of that period, something like 40% of the population were in that very extreme poverty. At the end of the period, it was less than 10%. We moved from a situation in the world where there were 4 billion people not living in that very extreme poverty to a situation where there were 7 billion. And it was about the combination of identifying a moment where stuff was possible and then identifying loads of stuff you could do which would realize that possibility.
We were talking a bit earlier about the importance here of political will, and I think it's a thing I wanted to pick up on because it may come as a bit of a shock to some listeners, accustomed as we all are to interpreting everything politicians do through the most cynical of motives. But was it your experience, has it been your experience that actually it does happen, that sometimes a minister or a prime minister or a president will just say, we should do this because it's the right thing to do?
Most of the politicians I know, not all of them, we might talk about some of the exceptions, but most of them come into public life because they want to make a difference to some things. And that's what Claire Shaw wanted to do when she became the minister at the Department for International Development. Now, she was lucky because she found herself working for one prime minister, in her case, Tony Blair, who not at the beginning, actually, but as time passed, got into this as well. Gordon Brown also got heavily into it. Cameron got into it, and so did Theresa May. So we have 4 prime ministers in a row, unusually, who took a exceptional decision, really, to prioritise this kind of work compared to other things their governments had to do. Elected politicians in Western countries are much more constrained than we often give them credit for. I mean, if you're elected as a prime minister, as Keir Starmer's just found, there's a whole bunch of things you just have to do. You have to try and fix the health service. You have to sort out education. You need an adequate defence budget. And actually, your room for manoeuvre is quite limited. The whole thing about development as a policy area for Western governments is that it's discretionary. You don't have to do it.
But for those prime ministers, though, that you identify, though, 2 Labour, 2 Tory, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, did they nevertheless think that there was a self-interest argument for pursuing this as well? I guess this is the difference between thinking of foreign aid as a charity and thinking of foreign aid as an investment. Did they also do this thinking, sincerely, this is good for the United Kingdom and its people as well?
Well, they certainly said increasingly that's what they thought. And in 2015, a new strategy was published, cooked up by George Osborne, in fact, as part of his spending review. One of the things we said in the book is I was the permanent secretary in the Department for International Development then, and Justine Greening, my political boss, the Secretary of State. The first we heard of this strategy that George Osborne had cooked up was 2 days before he wanted to publish it. So he cooked it up all himself. And the rationale, the argument he made was, yes, poverty is important of its own right. We have some moral responsibilities. But actually, we need to build a safer world for us as well. And dealing with problems far away, conflicts and organised crime and climate and so on, that's in our interest. Now, actually, I think if really they'd been pursuing just their very narrow national interest, they'd have found other ways to spend that money. So I give them more credit than they give themselves. I think they did genuinely believe this is just the right thing to do. That all changed, of course, when Boris Johnson arrived.
Well, on the subject of Boris Johnson, we do have a clip we want to play you. This is Andrew Natsios, who did a not dissimilar job to the one you were doing, but he did it from Washington, D.C. This is what he thought.
The worst thing that Boris Johnson did to merge DFID into the Foreign Office, that was a catastrophe. The greatest aid agency in Europe was DFID, and our best partners, I might add. I am disgusted with what happened in Britain over that.
The worst thing Boris Johnson ever did. Those are big words. But
so that's a competitive field, Andrew. I mean, there's lots of things on that list. Certainly, I agree with Andrew that if the Johnson government had been concerned that they wanted to spend not quite so much money on aid, they could just have reduced the expenditure. Destroying, vandalising an institution, that is what wreckers and mad people do. Johnson claimed he still wanted to do one or two things in international development. He recognised he needed to make nice on the climate change issue. He said he wanted to do something about girls' education. If that had been true, he wouldn't have destroyed the institution. In fact, the reason, as we explain in the book, that the institution was destroyed was because the Conservative Party again became under the grip of its right-wing elements, those people who've been in control really in the 80s and 90s. And they were people who, frankly, weren't at all sure that these poorer countries getting richer was that good an idea. Maybe these poorer countries getting richer would mean they would start to have opinions of their own. Maybe those opinions would be injurious to those of the interests of the UK and so on. So it was coming from a view that this development stuff, not just expensive, but maybe it's not a good idea either. And maybe what we should be doing, if there is a bit of money in this international spending area, is using it much more directly to promote British interests, like subsidising exports or buying votes in the UN in one way or another. In other words, as a sort of slush fund to lubricate other objectives. And that sort of is where Boris Johnson got to. Curiously, there are elements of that are still in the firmament now as the new government, Keir Starmer's government, and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, are wrestling with as well. David Lammy's got this idea of wanting to leverage the development effort for other objectives. And, one thing you learn if you read the book is that's basically the road to ruin. If you start to use the aid programme to try to achieve other objectives, you end up with one scandal after another. We enjoyed ourselves by retelling a lot of those scandals in the book. The most famous is this Pergao Dam in Malaysia, where in order to win hundreds of millions of pounds worth of arms contracts, the British government in the late 1980s, around 1990, agreed to a request from the government of Malaysia to build a dam on the Pergao River. That was a decision which was subsequently found to be contrary to the provisions of the 1980 International Development Act, and the government was hauled through the courts, lost, and had to backtrack. So what happens if you mix too many objectives up is you end up in a mess.
That was Sir Mark Lowcock, who was also the UN's Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief. His new book, The Rise and Fall of the Department for International Development, is available now. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. Foreign aid is often caricatured as a somewhat sappy preoccupation of the liberal side of politics, which is unfair in itself, but also neglects to acknowledge that there is an abundantly solid conservative argument in favour of foreign aid. At his office in the Palace of Westminster, we spoke to the Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell, former Shadow Foreign Secretary and former Secretary of State for International Development. I began by asking Andrew the big question: how would he sum up the Conservative case for foreign aid?
Our foreign aid and development budget makes Britain safer and more prosperous because it makes the poorest and most difficult parts of the world safer and more prosperous. So it is clearly an issue of national interest. I would argue that every penny of the British development budget is or should be spent in the national interest, but it is also the right thing to do. It makes a massive contribution to doing something about the extraordinary discrepancies of opportunity and wealth which disfigure our world.
But that line you say about how every penny of our aid budget must be spent in the UK's national interest ultimately, is there an argument, as you see it, that maybe aid is actually, how to put it, more effective when it's actually less idealistic? That if you go into it with a very clear idea of what your own reasons for being involved in this are, it actually works out best for both parties?
Well, I think I'm making a much subtler point, which is this: that making the world safer and more prosperous is in all of our interests. That's what the development programme sets out to do. And if you look at our white paper that was published last November, you can see very clearly that aid only works when it's done in partnership, when both the recipient and the donor have the same priorities and are pursuing it in the same way. The example I always give is that back in the bad old days, the World Bank would always insist that water should be provided through privatized means. Now, we never took that view. We said water should be provided in whatever is the most effective way to get it through to people who need access to clean water. And you won't do that if you do it against the grain of what the recipient country is trying to achieve. So I would argue there is no disconnect between my statement that all British aid is spent in the national interest, because if it isn't spent well, it won't work. And what is it spent for? It makes us safer and more prosperous. And of course, for a lot of people, the great importance of international development is that by developing safer and more prosperous societies over there, people don't need to make the dangerous journey to the richer world because they can see for themselves that development's taking place in their own country, or that security is growing in their own country.
But in your time working in this field, have you found that a difficult case to make to Conservative voters? Because I will wager you will have heard more than once the reply, but there are poor people here now.
Yes, I mean, that's true. And in a sense, I failed, because DFID has now been vaporised, and the promise we made to the poorest people in the world. And I will remind you that Archbishop Desmond Tutu said that a promise to the poorest people is a sacred thing. We broke our promise on the 0.7, and Labour not only have not restored it, but they've actually taken money out of the development budget, which Jeremy Hunt, the former finance minister, put into it to soften the cost of first-year asylum seekers. So yes, you're right. And the reason I set up Project Umubano in Rwanda, which took hundreds and hundreds of Tories to Rwanda, was so they could see for themselves at first hand what works and what doesn't work in terms of development in a poor country which uses our money very well. So absolutely. But what is interesting about this, is that the Tory line often is charity begins at home, to which I would always say charity does begin at home, but it doesn't end there. And actually, if you make the case, as David Cameron did, and also Theresa May too, and they're supportive of the development minister, as David was of me, then you can score runs. So, and the proof of this is that during the years of austerity from 2010 onwards, support for international development went up from about 46% to 50% amongst the population at large. It went up much more than that amongst women, and it went up even more than that amongst people under the age of 30. So if you make the case that development is in the national interest, it works, and I would regard DFID as having been one of the key ingredients of British international leadership, respected around the world since Suez, actually. It's an example of real, genuine British leadership and effectiveness. But be in no doubt that the Tory party is very receptive to this message if it is expressed in the right way. And you see that because, loads of members of Conservative Party associations across the country, also members of organisations like Oxfam or Christian Aid or WaterAid. So it's not a surprise that should be the case. But you do have to make the case. And so, one of my worst moments in politics was when I had to rub my eyes and check I was still on planet Earth. I heard a Conservative Prime Minister say from the dispatch box that DFID, I think I quote his words exactly, was a cash machine in the sky spewing out taxpayers' money. I literally could not believe what I had heard.
This is Boris Johnson, presumably, on whose instructions DFID was, as you put it, vaporised. Did you try to make the case to him directly and personally at the time?
Well, they kept the decision very, very tight. I was informed about 10 minutes before he stood up in the House of Commons. And remember, this was during COVID. So I was not in London. I was in my constituency of the Royal Town of Sutton Coldfield when it happened. And I couldn't physically, in 10 minutes, get to London to upbraid him from the back benches of the House of Commons. But I think development in Britain is at its best when it is seen as a British policy and not as a Labour, Conservative or Lib Dem policy. And that's what we had created with the 0.7 and DFID under Tony Blair, particularly, and David Cameron, established that all-party nature of it before Boris Johnson came in and ruined it.
One idea which I think sums up a lot of what you've just said and a lot of what you've written and said about this subject before, and this is this idea you've mentioned of a kind of Marshall Plan for North Africa and the Sahel, a sort of massive investment in these very troubled regions to, as you were saying, forestall anybody's desire to leave this place because they can make a perfectly decent life for themselves where they are. Realistically, is that something you could go out and campaign on and win an election on, do you think? And if you were going to try, how would you sell it to the kind of voters that you're hoping would vote for you?
Well, it's a very interesting point. I mean, I don't think democratically elected governments are going to find it easy to get re-elected if they can't do something about what their electors believe to be a critical problem, which is immigrants coming in illegally. And I think you're seeing that all around Europe at the moment. So what the idea of a Marshall Plan, which is very much in inverted commas, means is this. If you want to try and stop this weight of humanity coming from very difficult parts of the world, and remember that we did some polling for those people who've been driven out of Syria into the camps surrounding Syria in the 4 countries that were taking people in very large numbers. And the polling showed us that what the people there really wanted to do was not to get in a leaky boat and go across to Europe. They wanted to go back to the place from which they'd been driven when it was safe to do so. So people's instincts are not to emigrate. They want a life where they can look after their children, they can have the things that we take for granted, and that they're safe and that they have the opportunity to make enough money to look after their family. The point about the Marshall Plan really is this, that you will not solve this problem by the government here announcing they're going to spend 80 million in North Africa, or the Italians saying they'll do the same thing. What you need is a European approach, and it has to be an approach which seeks to build the sinews of the sort of life I described in the countries from which these people come. If you approach it in that very significant way, you can make sure that everyone has rights and responsibilities to stop people coming, but you've got to give real opportunities in those countries in terms of training and export and so forth. For the people who are there. And also, you've got to recognise that we live in a part of the world where fertility rates are very low. And we need, if you go into any hospital, and you will see we are utterly dependent in Britain on people who have come from overseas to bring their skills and help us here. And you need an approach which recognises low fertility rates here, high fertility rates in many parts of Africa. And so there must be a proper legal route for people to come into the United Kingdom. And when Rishi made his big statement as Prime Minister, the Labour Party were never able. I saw Labour ministers in pain trying to avoid saying anything about safe and legal routes. But Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, said from the dispatch box, once we've sorted out this problem and got it under control of illegal migration, we will look at safe and legal routes. And that's what you've got to do.
There is on the wall behind where I'm sitting a certificate that you earned for outstanding recognition from USAID. So I'm sure there is a kind of global community of people who work in this field. Is there a feeling among people who work in this field, though, that the idea of foreign aid is on the back foot a little bit due to those isolationist tendencies in governments who are, I guess, responsive to those concerns of voters that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, there is, because we live at a time that is more dangerous in the world than at any time in any of our lives. But it's also a time where you badly need the international system to solve these big problems of migration we've talked about, but also of climate change and of pandemics. You need an international system, but the international system has been blown apart by Putin invading a neighbouring country as one of the permanent 5 members of the United Nations, and the fact that we live in a world of narrow nationalism and strong male leaders, from Xi to Putin to Modi to Erdogan to Trump. These are narrow nationalists, and it's the tragedy that the world, particularly now, is so dangerous and needs the international system so much and hasn't got it. And I am certain that Gaza would never have unfolded as it has when DFID was in existence. Why? Because any Secretary of State, as the humanitarian situation in Gaza became clearer, any DFID secretary would have said to the senior people who populated DFID and who operated all around the world and often had come from the bank or the international system or the fund or the United Nations, and would have said, go and talk to everybody, make a plan that everyone can sign up to. You don't have to put a Union Jack on it, but you have to have a plan for how we sort out the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which would carry credibility as well with the Israeli government. And
just to pick that up, you think a Secretary of State for Foreign Development would have been better placed to do that than, for example, a Foreign Secretary or equivalent from one of Israel's allies?
What I'm saying is that the extraordinary mix of connections and very senior people from the international system who populated the top of DFID aren't there anymore. I mean, the structure has become very confused, but let's not get into that. I'm making a much narrower point, that what was required was one plan, really good plan, that the international community could put into operation and which would carry credibility with the Israelis. And I believe that we would have been able to do that. What we have had instead is a little bit from the Brits, a little bit from the Americans, a little bit from the Jordanians, the Saudis, the United Nations, the European Union. And we've ended up with aid being delivered into Gaza from the air, killing people upon whom it landed, a pontoon being towed across the Atlantic from Virginia, which then broke up within a few days because of the bad weather, when you've got a perfectly good road system that have got the aid in. So I am saying very clearly that the loss of DFID has had a significant effect on the international humanitarian community being able to carry out effective work in Gaza. And we have seen that very clearly in the events that have taken place since the horrific tragedy of October the 7th last year.
That was the British MP and former Secretary of State for International Development, Andrew Mitchell. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. I'm joined finally on the show by Kathryn Nwajiaku-Dahou, Director of the Politics and Governance Programme at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI. Kathryn joins us from Paris. Kathryn, let's start with a very basic question. Have you personally encountered examples of foreign aid actually making a perceptible difference on the ground and working like it's supposed to?
I think there are many examples. I know one in particular close to my heart, on which I worked with ODI, and it was an FCDO program, DFID at the time, and it was a governance program. A governance program meaning an attempt to improve the way citizens demanded accountability from their governments and the way governments responded to those demands for accountability. It was called PEARL, meaning the Partnership to Engage, Reform and Learn. And its purpose was really that, to what DFID called at the time, focus on supply and demand side pressures. So working with local, state government actors, working with the federal government, but also working with coalitions of civil society organizations to enable them to get in the same room with policymakers and so on. Now, ODI was responsible for accompanying part of this work in a kind of learning and monitoring initiative. And we also evaluated some 20 years of governance programming, both Pearl and its predecessor programs. So looking at FCDO's governance footprint, and the results were overall very positive. That in some states, particularly in the northeast of Nigeria, states known for a lot of conflict and insecurity, that FCDO, DFID's engagement was at least during some administrations able to inculcate and support more accountable, reformist approaches to governance challenges. And so, that particular project example, and we were able to look over a long period of time, was relatively positive. I would say, in the same breath, however, that my observation when we were evaluating this program was that there was a lot that was happening outside the programmatic space. So it was the moment when there was a big NSARS movement in Nigeria. It was very discussed on social media and in the media. And what was challenging was the ability of this programmatic approach to engage with this very dynamic process of change happening in the country. And it leads me to a bigger observation, which is that whilst there could be a case to be made for the good that foreign assistance has, or foreign aid has had, or has been responsible for in developing countries, the fact that much of the work tends to be project specific, and it's very difficult to cumulatively make an assessment of what the overall impact has been on a particular trajectory of a country, is, I think, a problem that we face. And it's kind of central to some of the debates around aid and its purpose that are becoming more and more vociferous at the moment.
But from your own experience of it and seeing these programs working up close, whether they've worked out well or not worked out quite as they were intended to, how has your thinking evolved on what kind of things do actually work, ideally in both directions for both donor and recipient, and what kind of things don't?
Well, let me start with what kinds of things don't work. What I have in mind is what started out very positively as an approach, and I'm referring back again to the Pearl program, so I think that's quite a useful way of focusing the imagination. So what started off very positively as an approach which was going to be adaptive, which was going to be responsive, which was going to continuously reflect and learn on what worked and what didn't, ended up being, unfortunately, the value for money agenda, being able to account for every penny, became a very important driving force within the project. So what had started off as open, adaptive to new ideas and change and so on, which is really critical in an evolving, developing country context, became what is disparagingly often referred to as a kind of bean counting obsession, with upward accountability in a very tightly managed, log-framed, specific project approach.
Where do you think that nervousness about the expenditure came from, that bean counting, as you put it? Was there a worry at the pointy end that this was going to be politically difficult back home, that this would lead to another row about where is our money being spent?
I think this is not a problem particular to the UK. I think this back and forth between what makes for good development, the whole effectiveness agenda that was really at a high point in the early 2010, 2011, and then was replaced by this value for money obsession. I think that happened all across OECD countries with different, changing political landscapes where there was an increasing questioning of being much more that flexibility. Also, scandals, perhaps, not particularly the UK, but all over, always create a kind of knee-jerk pulling back from that flexibility idea. Increasing scrutiny at parliamentary level about, what aid money was being spent on. But then I also think, that's one way of looking at it. But I also think the absence of champions, real champions ideologically for the utility of aid allows that kind of bean counting mentality to gain the upper hand. I think I'm thinking back to the high point when there was Claire Short and co in the hot seat in DFID, and she also had cabinet seat. That was a very different ethos around aid. And so you had an ideological space in which it was possible to be much more experimental and adaptive. Once you don't have that, whether or not that's parliamentary scrutiny is an issue, you are going to have a very different profile at a country level in terms of what a project looks like.
What do you think then aid needs? And if we sort of narrow it down, I guess, to the British context, and you refer back to those figures like Gordon Brown, Claire Short, who were great enthusiasts and great advocates for aid, if the British government of the moment, whether the Prime Minister or somebody else, wished to get out in front of this, what kind of case do you think would help? Because we all know what the argument against it is. People say, look, this is all our money being sent overseas, but is there an argument that can or should be made, not only just that it does good at that end, but it does good at this end as well?
Very interesting question. I think, well, two things. One, the overall consensus on whether aid is a good thing or a bad thing is actually quite difficult to discern. What we do have is a lot of populist noise around how it's not a good thing, and that translated into aid cuts and so on under the last administration. I do think in order to make a case for aid, you do need a champion at a very senior level, head of state level, prime ministerial level, or at the level of the Treasury first. And then secondly, I do think the world has changed since those heady days of the Gordon Brown and Claire Short. We are in a different global economic moment, a different political moment in terms of geopolitics. And so the options are different. However, we have global challenges, climate being one of them. We saw the global challenge that was the health pandemic around COVID. We have issues to do with insecurity and violence that are not just problems for would-be developing countries, lower and middle income, but are problems at home. And so in some ways, if you want, my bet would be on making a case for development as a global public could, which we would all benefit from. And, there are a number of very interesting ideas, for example, being pitted by Jonathan Glennie around this idea of global public investment. And this is an idea where, instead of thinking of aid as a temporary transfer from a donor country to a recipient country, we start thinking much more in terms of different countries pooling their resources based on their ability to address some global concerns of which they all have a stake in. Because we've seen how COVID knows no borders. We've seen that climate crisis, borne very heavily by the poorest countries, it has to be said, but is a crisis of which we're all existentially threatened. So I do think there's a possibility of concocting a new kind of narrative around what purpose aid that we need a champion for.
Just finally then, if I could, at the risk of summing all that up somewhat glibly. Does it need to be rethought or reframed or maybe repitched, not so much as aid, but as a partnership, that this is not something that is being given and received, but that this is a collaborative enterprise?
I do think it needs to be thought of as partnership, but that word partnership has been so bandied around, almost even like cooperation, So I think the question is understanding what we put into it. The UK, for example, lost a lot of kudos after its slashing of aid and a lot of credibility, because aid is not just the amounts, but it's also the leeway it provides, the relationships that it helps to build, and the credibility that it affords the donor country in terms of it being serious about bringing everybody up to a certain level. So I do think partnership is important, but we also have to remember that the so-called partners, the recipients of aid, are asking for very different things now. So there is, as I said at the beginning, there's a geopolitical shift where China, Russia to a less extent, we hear a lot about Russia, but it's really China, Turkey, Indonesia are all investing in those countries that used to be the recipients of UK aid, French aid, and so on. And so there is a market that countries have access to. And so the requests from those countries, the demands of partners are different. So they're asking for infrastructure, they're asking for more facilitating more private investment, they're asking for fiscal space, they're asking for transfer of technology as, all part of what a good partner would be interested in sharing. And I do think it's those kinds of questions that any would-be, modern donor needs to consider. ODI is doing quite a bit of work right now, trying to convene conversations exactly about that, what the new narrative, what the new rationale for aid should be. And it's not aid on its own, but aid as part of a plethora of relationships and financing mechanisms that are really required for the era that we are now in.
That was Kathryn Nwajiaku-Dahou of the Overseas Development Institute. Thank you for joining us on the Foreign Desk. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week with our wrap-up of the events of 2024. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota, Chris Chermak and Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. Lily also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye, and this time, Merry Christmas.